Thank you. I appreciate that.
Set. I think we're all set. We should probably move on to the next topic, which is that circuit breaker, right? SPED funding and circuit breaker?
I mean, I think we kind of touched on that.
We did a little bit.
The governor, I think, made a good, jump. I think that was one of the best pieces of his thing. Carl's going to get some numbers to me to help, but I think that's one of the most important things. And I think a couple people touched on transportation or maybe changing the percentage. And the reality is changing those things may be great, but those are things that I think if we had additional resources and said, well, where would we put these? Do we put it through Chapter 70 formula? Do we maybe be more generous in how we handle special ed reimbursement? When we have that extra money, that would be, I think, the time for that debate. Do we, is it formula? Is it split here? Is it split there? Some people would maybe do more depending where you're at in regional school transportation. Some people might do more depending on how much land they have by the state in terms of payment lower taxes. Or maybe you'd split and put a little in all of those. But that's when you can have, I think, a meaningful debate, a realistic debate about whether we should go to 4 times, 3 times, 3.5 times, include transportation, a percentage of transportation, different models. Mel?
I would just simply say that more money in circuit breaker is probably one of the best things you could do because it's the most unpredictable thing in our budget. Second thing, which kind of relates to that, is the state taking a look at this whole issue of unilateral placements, and then someone places their child unilaterally in an out-of-district school. We challenge that. It goes to court. We lose. We not only have to pay for the child's tuition, and we also lose the court costs. I think there needs to be, the state needs to look at.
I was under the impression on court costs, there's been some rollback in court costs.
I thought if they won the ruling, the court costs are covered.
Well, you
I'm
have to
pretty.
get to a final decision.
Yeah,
You
I don't.
have to actually go to the court.
If you win the
proceeding,
ruling.
if you settle up
But
in
there,
court
but
form.
right, but there are. I think there's legislation that would even roll it back further. That would basically say almost your court costs are covered even if you win on like 99% or lose on 99%. Like one little thing, all the court costs. I mean, so there are some things to even move it back.
Well, that would be helpful because one of the things that when we look at whether we're going to challenge these placements, we say, is it worth it? Because if we lose, we're going to be out an additional $100,000 in addition to the tuition.
No, I'm saying I think there's legislation up there that would make the court cost thing even more.
That'd be good. Okay.
MASC has a bill that they've submitted this year that would move support for in-district placement. So if we're an inclusive district, and if we keep somebody in-house, at some point, we should be compensated for that.
Okay.
Right.
And that's good for everybody. It reduces cost. It's good for the community. It's good for the children.
Do you have a docket number?
I don't have a docket number for it.
If you, in what they send around, can send it to me, we'll take a look at it. Absolutely.
We help sponsor that with MASC to get them, and that was their first priority to move legislation. So
Okay.
it's new, but it changes the rates depending on where you're sending children.
Right.
And to me, that made huge sense because it will reduce cost overall.
Right. Okay.
Brad,
Okay.
in addition to the change in the legal fee reimbursement type of thing, what about the process itself about the unilateral outplacement? Just in terms of any help from the state there? The process?
There's probably a bunch of, but what I was trying to say, there's a bunch of bills on both sides. Probably some that you, from the towns, from the administrative perspective, you wouldn't like. That would add more costs and this and that. So there's sort of bills on both sides of the spectrum. The last few years, really none of them have gone forward. There's the potential, and I don't know what the numbers are going to treat you to, that we just did RICA, which is autism as a mandated coverage, which has a consequence in terms of health insurance, but potentially has a consequence in terms of maybe the insurance being able to cover things that were on the autism spectrum or a piece of it that might have been covered through special ed, but now might be covered through insurance. That's still kind of ramping in, so that may have some impacts. That's an unknown right now. Are we getting cold again, or? Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
Just to sort of give a real world perspective on the circuit breaker, I have a son who's basically, the cost of his program, which is in town, is affected by the circuit breaker in terms of the cost is sufficient that the town would, right now, it is presently, there's a foundation, for those who don't know, the foundation budget is about, whatever the figure is, 4 times that is about $38,000, give or
Right.
take. Towns are entitled for reimbursement, a percentage of the cost beyond that
Right.
point.
Right.
Presently, I think it's 42% for the most recent year.
Right.
42.
And if the budget goes forward as planned, it might bring it back up to 70-something
Right.
percent. The promise has always been that it'll be 75%,
Right.
but it's never actually, I believe, been funded.
I think the highest we ever got was maybe 71
71.
or 70, right around there. We were really, really close.
And just speaking from a personal perspective, it's allowed the town, these costs are spent by the town, that allow them to keep somebody in town who probably would have most likely been in a private placement.
Right.
Which is one of the more expensive things, and then you add transportation onto that. So it's basically, there's some benefit to the town of keeping him in town. There's the social benefits of him actually being able to interact with kids of his own age, and gives him a much better potential going forward. Because otherwise, he's within the class of kids who might be a lifelong needer of services.
Right.
He has a much better chance of being in an inclusive environment to make progress to the point where whatever level of support he may need in the future will be much less. Hopefully none, but certainly less, because he's been able to be educated in an environment where he can build his overall skill sets in terms of interacting with people. And also, if you look at private placements, frankly, a lot of them aren't really strong in academics.
Right.
The best academics tend to live in public schools.
Right.
I've done the placement searches, I've seen what's out there. And for a kid to get the access to the knowledge that they need in order to be successful going forward, it's just really important that it not be such a stress, I believe, on towns to be able to do what they'd like to do, and also do it in a way that benefits not just the town, but the student as well.
Yep, definitely. Are we all set with special ed and circuit breakers? We'll move to the 4th point, which again is the remaining unfunded mandates.
You mean?
All of those remaining.
This is one of the challenging ones, because I think it maybe, Cliff, MASC is at one point maybe put something together on this, didn't necessarily quantify it. It's kind of an amorphous topic.
It's a huge number of items. Well, it's not a huge number. It's a large number of items, and I can't remember all of the details.
Right.
Because all I did was put the stuff together. I didn't try to analyze all of it.
Right.
But the numbers are huge. 25% of the cost is in those unfunded mandates. And again, the Chapter 70 reimbursement that we get, or the share that we get from the state, amounts to about 15%. That leaves 10% truly unfunded, not covered in any way
Right.
by outside.
Well, it would be helpful, and I, quite frankly, I think I've yet to sort of get like the most solid, comprehensive list outlining
I can send you the file.
of what they specifically are. I mean, theoretically, under Prop 2.5, when we pass legislation, we're supposed to pay it. Now, obviously, it's pretty easy to put a notwithstanding in any piece of legislation, and basically notwithstanding means despite what the law says, this is what we're gonna do. Or despite what every other law says, this is what we're gonna do. And I agree, there's, Jim Lyons from Andover has filed something on unfunded mandates to really look at them. The auditor is supposed to review things about whether something's an unfunded mandate, and occasionally rules that something isn't a mandate. That was one of the things that happened with and we had pushed this at the time when it first happened, was the most recent determination by the auditor was the whole U.S. special Senate election that we had in January. So that we pick up the cost, and we said that's, you're doing this because we changed the law. Originally, that way that special election would have held, it would have been held at a November election, whether it was in an even year. But because of the special, that was a pretty expensive thing. Towns should get reimbursed for what they were able to determine their costs were. So, it is a big issue. No?
Even bigger is unfunded mandates, and I want to take a look at Cliff's file from that group, but even worse than unfunded mandates are when you take away funding like the Quinn bill, which
Right.
not only financially, but morally and ethically, I just don't even understand how the state can do that. And it's the same thing with the circuit breaker.
Mhm.
States never hit the 75% amount that it's supposed to reimburse towns and cities above that certain, whatever that cutoff tuition is. The Quinn bill boggles my mind. This is a state program. Yes, the towns and cities had to accept it.
Mhm.
And then the state funds it, and all of a sudden saying, surprise, we're not, basically not funding it anymore. That's gonna cost
But it's
us,
a mandate, yeah.
what, $150,000 a year?
Close to the 200,000.
Yeah.
$200,000 a year.
What you want?
And it's like the state doesn't even think twice about doing that. I just don't, I don't get it.
Mhm.
That's not a question.
I
guess
mean,
it's a statement.
it's just I mean, I can tell you, you can go back. It was in 09. I mean, the vote and funding was. I forget what the vote was. I voted against the reduction because I thought they were going too fast, too far. Because I thought basically what has happened, at least in terms of it essentially being a form of local aid. I think there would be some people who say what the Quinn bill was originally intended for it to become when it became a proposal, to what it morphed into is maybe changed dramatically. Well, and then, so I think the idea was, well, okay, what reforms should be put in place? I think it's sort of, instead of looking at it and sort of saying what are rational, reasonable reforms, and maybe reforms that are sort of prospective, it was sort of, well, let's take a meat cleaver, and leave this kind of, this crater. And, you know, obviously we know what it means, you know, right now for North Reading, and obviously not following through in saying, you know, is it something that can be negotiated under, what are the obligations and that, and there's gonna be a dialogue and debate about that this year too, because it's a big issue, and there are other issues that are out there right now. SJC just made a ruling, and I don't know, Greg, and you guys, if you had to deal with the whole Evergreen issue. I don't mean Evergreen Solar, I mean Evergreen in terms of essentially, basically, if, you know, a contract can't exceed 3 years, but basically saying that if a contract, you know, contract hasn't been renegotiated, sort of the general practice or expectation was that sort of everything that's sort of in place would stay in place while an agreement, a new agreement or success agreement is worked out. This has kind of been upended because, as I recall, it was maybe a Boston Housing Authority case relative to the firemen, and they changed the staffing, and staffing in that instance was something they could negotiate over, but the contract expired, they changed staffing, went to court, and the SJC ruled that, no, it's in play for 3 years. That's another issue that is up there, and some people feel need to be addressed.
Yes, I've asked this question 3 times, even at the MMA conference, and I wasn't sure if I got the answer that